Before the ocean learned language, it already knew guilt. Every tide, every crash against the rocks, every whisper that slithered into a sailor's ear, all of it was an apology that no one remembered to forgive. The waves didn't sing, they confessed. Every shore was a confessional, and every echo was a penance no one had asked for. Somewhere beneath that old sorrow, a god slept. He wasn't supposed to. Gods aren't built to sleep. They either burn or vanish. They're the act of being witnessed, the shape of belief sculpted into eternity. But this one, Thalen, god of the depths, architect of every drowning, had done the unthinkable. He had grown tired of his own voice. When he first created the tides, he thought he was making balance, the breathing of the world. When he sank the first ship, he believed he was teaching respect. And when he swallowed entire coastlines, whole cities that had stopped fearing the sea, he told himself it was justice. But justice, when spoken underwater, sounded a lot like loneliness. So Thalen sank deeper. He sank past coral that shimmered like stained glass, past whales who sang eulogies for things that had never lived, past the bones of those who once called him savior. He sank until even his name fell silent. He let coral claim his crown. He let barnacles crust over his chest like old sins refusing to fall away. He let time sift through him like silt through open fingers. He thought he would sleep forever. He almost did. Centuries later, after the age of prayers and punishment had turned to the age of forgetting, a fisherman cast his net into waters that had forgotten how to shimmer. His name was Einar. He was 35, and his face looked carved by bad weather, eyes the color of old storms, skin roughened by years of salt and stubbornness. His beard was patchy like frost that couldn't decide whether to stay. His hands were rope, his heart an anchor. He fished because his father had, and because silence paid better than honesty. That morning, the sea was flat, unnervingly flat. The gulls had vanished before dawn, and even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. The horizon looked fragile, like glass that might crack if looked at too hard. Einar spat over the side of his small wooden boat. "Fine," he muttered. "If the gods want me hungry, I'll eat the worms myself." He didn't know the irony of that prayer. The sea did. The first tug came before sunrise. It wasn't heavy at first, just insistent, like something politely asking to be noticed. But when he pulled the rope, it didn't move. The net refused to rise. Then the rope hummed. It pulsed, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to him. The air thickened. The world tilted slightly, as though the horizon had taken a breath. And the sea, that vast, ancient lyre, began to glow. The net surfaced slowly, dragging light with it. At first, Einar thought it was debris, a tangle of kelp maybe, or some half-sunken altar dragged up from one of the drowned ruins. But beneath the strands of green and gold, something gleamed. A body, pale, human-shaped, beautiful in the way things preserved by salt often are, fragile, smooth, timeless. Einar froze. The body wasn't bloated. It wasn't swollen or waterlogged. It looked peaceful, as if it had been sleeping under glass. And then, as he reached out, he noticed the faintest flicker of light beneath its ribs, a slow pulse. He hesitated. Then, despite every superstition clawing at his spine, he touched the shoulder. The skin was warm. The eyes opened. They were not human eyes. They were tidal, silver green, swirling with depths too wide to belong in flesh. When they blinked, the ocean itself responded. The water around the boat inhaled, lifted, and exhaled again, as though recognizing its maker. Einar stumbled backward, nearly falling into the net. Gods! The figure sat up, water streaming down from his hair, each drop glowing faintly before dissolving into air. His breath came out heavy, a low, thunderous sound, like a storm remembering its first roar. His second breath was quieter, sadder. Einar stood rigid, heart drumming in his ears. Who are you?" The stranger looked at his hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. His voice, when it came, was deep and deliberate, like a man learning how to shape words again after centuries of dreaming them. "I don't remember," he said softly, "but I remember drowning." The horizon flickered, sunlight bending as if confused by its own reflection. The ocean beneath the boat swelled, Not violently, but reverently. Einar's throat went dry. You're one of them, aren't you? A god. The man looked up toward the dawn, squinting as if the light itself were foreign. That single word hit harder than thunder. It carried the weight of an empire collapsing in slow motion. Then the man shivered violently. The sea darkened beneath the boat, spiraling like a heartbeat losing rhythm. Einar lunged forward on instinct, gripping the man's shoulders. "Breathe," he shouted, though he couldn't have explained why. The man, inhaled sharply. The waves stilled. The wind turned. The morning held its breath. He coughed once, salt water spilling from his lips, then laughed, low, astonished. His eyes glowed faintly gold now, no longer the cold green of divinity, but something warmer, human. That, he whispered, was new. The wind returned timidly, brushing against the sail like a nervous child. It moved through Einar's hair, as if unsure it was still allowed. Einar stepped back, heart pounding, staring at the man sitting in his boat like a broken miracle. "You're going to get me killed." The man smiled faintly. "Then I'll owe you my life twice." The sun rose slowly, pouring molten light across the water. The ocean turned copper, each wave glinting like metal forged in forgiveness. Beneath that glow, Thalen felt the weight of his own name crawl back into his chest like a half-forgotten memory. It didn't come all at once. It came in whispers, syllables carried by tide, fragments of prayers long drowned. Thalen. He closed his eyes. He remembered temples carved into cliffs, sacrifices offered in fear disguised as faith. He remembered his rage, his loneliness, his endless, echoing justice. And then he remembered something else. The silence, the sleep, the absence of being worshipped, the peace. He looked at Einar, the mortal who had dragged him from that silence. "You shouldn't have pulled me out," he said softly. Einar raised an eyebrow. "Next time, I'll let you rot." Thalen's smile deepened. Rotting would have been mercy. They sailed toward shore. Neither spoke for a long time. The ocean followed them, strangely quiet, like a pet that had just realized its master was mortal. Einar finally broke the silence. "So what happens now?" "You turn the world upside down again." Thalen looked at the horizon, his gaze unreadable. "No, this time, I think I'll see what happens when I don't." Einar frowned. "That's not much of a plan." Thalen smiled faintly. "It's more than I had last time." When they reached the harbor, no one believed Einar's story. Not that he told it often. He said only that he'd found a man half-drowned, half-mad, half-miracle. Thalen lived in silence by the sea's edge, rebuilding his strength, learning the shapes of human speech and laughter. He listened more than he spoke. He touched sand like it was sacred. Sometimes at night, when the tide came in too fast, Einar would hear him standing barefoot on the shore, whispering to the waves, "Breathe slower. You'll drown yourself again." And sometimes, when Einar was sure he was asleep, he'd hear the sea whisper back, "I'm trying." High above, in the halls where forgotten gods went to rust, something shifted. The old divinities stirred, jealous and afraid. "He's breathing again," they whispered through broken altars. "He's teaching the ocean mercy." One god of flame snarled, "If the sea learned forgiveness, what will the rest of us do with our worship?" Another god, carved from stone, sighed. Perhaps the end began the day he drowned himself. And from the deepest corner of eternity, something older than all of them smiled, a shadow with no mouth, amused by their panic. "Let him teach mercy," it said. "In the end, even mercy forgets how to breathe." But down below, far from the jealous heavens, Thalen sat on the rocks with his feet in the surf, watching the sky burn itself into sunset. Einar joined him, chewing on a piece of dried fish. "You ever miss it? The power?" Thalen thought for a long while. Power was the noise that kept me from hearing anything else. Einar grunted. "Sound exhausting." "It was," Thalen said. "That's why I slept." He looked down at his reflection, fractured by the waves. "And maybe that's why I woke." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and forgiveness. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang, a mortal sound, simple, unafraid. Einar watched him quietly. You're different from the stories. Thalen smiled. So is the sea if you listen long enough. The horizon breathed again, and the world, for the first time in 1,000 years, remembered what gentleness sounded like. By noon, the sea had learned how to pretend it wasn't watching them. The waves moved politely again, small and symmetrical, like courtiers bowing in shame. The gulls had returned, tracing cautious spirals above the boat, and even the wind had adopted a tone of forced normalcy, like someone awkwardly coughing after interrupting a funeral. Einar rowed in silence. The man, no, the god, sat across from him, wrapped in an old fishing net like a makeshift cloak. He looked like a memory pretending to be mortal. Too still, too aware of the air, too luminous beneath the grime of salt. He watched sunlight move across the water, as though every ripple carried a prophecy. Einar tried not to stare. He failed. You breathe, he muttered finally, as if accusing him of theft. You eat, sleep. Do you need what worship? The god tilted his head slightly. I need to remember. Well, Einar grunted, dipping the ear harder into the current. You can do that on land. I've got half a loaf of bread, and a neighbor who owes me a shirt. The god blinked slowly. Bread. He said the word like a prayer. You give your fire shape. I forgot that. Fire doesn't need shape, Einar said. It needs fuel. The god smiled faintly, eyes glinting like rain on obsidian. So do we? By the time they reached shore, the tide was retreating, leaving a gleaming mirror of wet sand that reflected the sky, like regret, pretending to be peace. The beach shimmered with broken shells and secrets, tiny, half-buried bones of things that had once floated and sang. A few villagers stood at a distance on the cliffs, whispering. They didn't know why they were whispering. They just knew they should. The stranger in Einar's boat unsettled the world in ways language couldn't contain. Children went quiet. Dogs refused to bark. Even the gulls widened their flight, uneasy. Einar ignored them all. He pulled the boat onto the sand and slung his net over his shoulder. Come on, he said. You look like a ghost someone forgot to finish drawing. The god followed him, barefoot. Every footprint he left behind filled instantly with water, then light, then nothing. It wasn't dramatic, just quietly wrong, like time tripping over itself. They reached Einar's cabin, a crooked structure of driftwood, rust, and stubbornness. It leaned slightly toward the sea, as if listening to gossip. Einar opened the door and lit the hearth. The small flame flickered into life, orange and warm, the first fire since dawn. The god flinched. You all right? Einar asked. The god stared into the flame, expression unreadable. It remembers me. That's called heat, Einar muttered. No. His voice dropped to a reverent hush. It remembers fear. The fire popped, almost in response. Einar fetched a cracked clay cup, filled it from a barrel, and handed it over. Drink. The god looked at the water, as if it were a mirror that had just accused him of murder. You want me to swallow myself? It's fresh water, Einar said. Different ocean. The god hesitated, then drank. The air shifted just slightly, as though something ancient had unclenched its fist. When he set the cup down, he said quietly, My name was Thalen. Einar froze. Was... Thalen nodded slowly. His voice held the weight of centuries unspoken. Once, I was a tide that chose who lived and who didn't. I drowned kings, lovers, children. I called it balance. But balance, he said, staring at his hands, was just loneliness pretending to be justice. He flexed his fingers. The sea doesn't forgive. It only mirrors what it's given. Einar sat down opposite him. And what does it mirror now? Thalen lifted his gaze. The firelight caught in his eyes, softening the silver into something almost human. Mercy, maybe. You pulled me out instead of letting me stay dead. Einar snorted. I was fishing, not saving gods. Thalen's smile was faint but real. Perhaps the difference is smaller than you think. That night, the sea forgot how to sleep. The waves began whispering, not in rhythm, not in language, but in overlapping murmurs, like a crowd arguing in dreams. They spoke of storms and sins, of promises drowned before they could be kept. Einar stood in the doorway of his cabin, arms crossed, staring out at the silver churn of the tide. The air smelled of rain that hadn't decided whether to fall. Behind him, Thalen rose from his place by the fire. His shadow flickered in the doorway, stretching too long, as if the night itself were trying to pull him back. "They're calling me," he murmured. Einar didn't turn. "Who?" "My children." His tone was half sorrow, half wonder. "The waves. They want to know if I still deserve them." Einar tightened his grip on the doorframe. "And do you?" Thalen didn't answer. Instead, he walked past him, stepping into the drizzle. His bare feet left no prints this time, only circles of trembling water that refused to close. The storm rose not from the horizon, but from below. Thunder came late, almost embarrassed to follow. The sea began to lift, swelling without wind. Lightning flickered deep under the surface, like veins awakening in the body of a sleeping giant. Thalen stood at the edge where foam met earth. "They remember what I was," he said softly. "They're afraid of what I've become." Einar grabbed his shoulder. "You'll drown again." Thalen smiled without turning. "That's what I do best." He walked forward, letting the tide embrace him up to his waist. The water curled around his legs, not violently but reverently, as if unsure whether to kiss or strike him. He looked back at Einar, eyes bright with defiance and sorrow. "Not this time." Then he stepped deeper. The sky cracked open. The sea froze mid-motion. Every drop of rain hung suspended, shimmering like glass beads. Every gust of wind folded in on itself, too afraid to continue. The storm waited. Thalen lifted his hand, trembling. "I was your anger," he whispered, "but you were my voice." The sea shuddered. Waves leaned toward him like a crowd leaning into a sermon. He took a breath, not the divine inhale that once commanded hurricanes, but a human breath, small, imperfect, real. Then he spoke one word, something between forgive and forget, a sound shaped like mercy being born. The waves collapsed in relief. The rain fell softly, like applause. For the first time in centuries, the sea bowed. Einar fell to his knees in the wet sand, shaking. "What are you doing?" Thalen turned slowly. His voice trembled, filled with awe. "I'm teaching it how to breathe." He exhaled. The clouds parted, not in fury, but in release. The storm unmade itself. Lightning faded into mist. Rain became drizzle, drizzle became dew. The ocean lay still, its surface smooth as a mirror learning humility. Einar looked at him, soaked, shivering, glowing faintly like sunrise through fog. "You're not a god anymore," he whispered. Thalen smiled softly. "Exactly." They sat by the dying fire that night, saying nothing. The sea outside sighed contentedly against the shore. Thalen stared into coals, his expression distant. "When I created tides, I thought I was giving rhythm to the world. I didn't understand that rhythm needs rest, too." Einar poked the fire with a stick. "You sound like my mother talking about men." Thalen chuckled softly. She was wiser than the gods. They sat there until the stars returned. Hundreds of them, blinking cautiously as if afraid the world might still be angry. Einar broke the silence. "What happens now?" Thalen didn't look up. Now the ocean listens for the first time. "And after that?" Thalen smiled faintly. "Maybe it will forgive itself." Einar grunted. "That's ambitious." "Forgiveness always is." By dawn, the village woke to calm seas and gulls, singing as if the night had been erased. Children ran barefoot through the surf, unafraid. Fishermen whispered to one another about strange lights on the water, about how the wind had changed its direction mid-dream. Einar's boat, however, rocked empty on the shore. Thalen was gone. Or maybe he wasn't gone, just spread too thin between the waves. Einar stood ankle-deep in the tide, staring out at the horizon that now seemed brighter, less cruel. He thought he heard a voice soft, carried by foam. "Breathe slower." He exhaled and smiled. "I'm trying." The sea rippled once, like laughter, and the day began, quieter than any in memory. But far below, where sunlight still refused to go, something else stirred a ripple in the darkness that didn't belong to the ocean. Not Thalin's kind of god. Older, deeper, the kind that had never learned guilt or language, only hunger. It felt the shift in the tides and the absence of tyranny. It tasted mercy on the currents like salt turned sweet, and it woke with a slow irritation of something that believed perfection has been insulted. It opened one eye, darker than the concept of endings, and whispered into the dark water. He's breathing again, up above, unaware what his act had awakened. Thalin stood on a cliff overlooking the dawn. The wind moved gently through his hair, not as servant, not as enemy, but as equal. Einar climbed up beside him, panting from the steep path. You planning on disappearing again? Eventually, Thalin said, smiling at the sea. Everything does. Not me, Einar grumbled. I've got debts. Thalin laughed. Then you're more mortal than you think. The horizon glowed gold. The world exhaled. For the first time in its long, ancient history, the ocean wasn't a god or a grave. It was just a heart, finally steady, finally calm. And on that edge between water and air, two men stood quietly, one who had forgotten how to be divine, and one who had never tried to be anything else. By morning, the storm had left behind an ocean that seemed almost shy. The waves rolled in slowly, careful not to make too much noise, as though embarrassed by last night's display. The sky looked raw, pale gold streaked with hesitant violet, like it hadn't yet decided what emotion to wear. Everything smelled of salt and aftermath, a tenderness too large to name. Einar sat on the porch of his crooked cabin, boots off, wringing rainwater from his hair. His shirt clung to him like a second, colder skin. The sea hissed softly against the rocks below, whispering its apologies to the shore. Beside him, Thalin watched the horizon with the intensity of someone reading a confession written in invisible ink. Every now and then, he would inhale sharply, as though the air itself still startled him. You always stare at it like that? Einar asked, breaking the long silence. Thalin's voice came quietly. It's different from this side. Einar chuckled, tossing a small pebble toward the water. From the side that doesn't drown people? Thalin didn't flinch. From the side that bleeds when it's cold. Einar raised an eyebrow. The pebble skipped once before sinking. You talk like a poet. I was a punishment, Thalin said simply. Poetry's the same thing with better timing. Einar blinked at him, then unexpectedly laughed. It wasn't loud or polite. It was real, short, and startled, like something that had forgotten it knew how to escape. The sound made Thalin look up. His expression softened, eyes wide with curiosity, as if he were watching something sacred. He studied Einar's face like a man trying to memorize what warmth looked like. You breathe loudly, Thalin said after a moment. That's how I know I'm still alive. Thalin tilted his head. Strange. I used to think silence was proof of life. Maybe that's your problem, Einar said, standing and stretching. You never learned the music of staying. Later that day, they walked into town. The path was muddy from the storm, the earth still steaming with the ghost of rain. Every puddle reflected something slightly wrong. Clouds that moved too slowly, birds that flew backward, light bending around them like the world wasn't finished stitching its seams. People stared. They didn't greet Einar, though he'd been part of the village's whole life. Instead, they stared at the man beside him, barefoot, draped in an old fishing net, his hair dark and wet as stormlight. They didn't know what he was, but they felt it, the way dogs sense thunder before it strikes, the way children hold their breath before asking a dangerous question. At the baker's stall, Thalin stopped. The smell of warm bread hit him like a hymn. He stared at the steam rising from the loaves, eyes wide, as though seeing worship take physical form. Einar grabbed a small piece on the counter and handed it to him. Don't stare at it. Eat it. Thalin hesitated, then obeyed. His first bite was slow, reverent. His second trembled. It's warm, he whispered. That's how food works, Einar said dryly. Thalin shook his head. No, not that kind of warm. It's alive. Einar sighed. If you start crying over bread, I'm leaving you here. But Thalin smiled faintly. For an instant, even the gulls circling above stopped calling. The world held its breath, confused by the softness of the moment. The baker, watching from behind the counter, murmured under her breath, "A storm walks like a man." They returned to the coast as the sun dipped behind the cliffs. The air smelled of salt and something new, a kind of quiet that wasn't emptiness but expectation. Einar walked ahead, muttering about firewood and the cost of feeding divine freeloaders. Behind him, Thalen trailed silently, gaze drifting toward the horizon. The light of dusk clung to him, softening the sharpness of his otherworldly features. That's when Einar heard it. At first, it was subtle, the sea imitating the sound of rope dragging against the hull or wind tangled in nets. But then the shape of it sharpened, syllables forming from foam. "Einar!" He stopped mid-step. "Did you hear that?" Thalen froze. The faint glow in his eyes dimmed to gray. "They're testing me." "Who?" "The sea," he murmured. "My old self. The part that doesn't understand gentleness." Einar turned toward the waves. "You said you were teaching it to breathe." "I was," Thalen said. "But teaching isn't the same as convincing." The water darkened. Foam gathered like teeth around the edges of the tide. The air pulsed, a heartbeat too large for lungs. From the waves rose a figure, made not of flesh but of memory. It had Thalen's face, the same jaw, the same eyes, but colder, perfect in the way knives are perfect. It spoke in a voice like thunder trapped inside glass. "You broke the balance." Thalen didn't move. "I broke the silence." "You betrayed your nature." "I changed it." The reflection's mouth curved into something cruel. "Mortals have infected you. They taught you to forgive." "Maybe," Thalen said quietly. "Or maybe I remembered that creation isn't the same as control." The reflection sneered. "You speak of mercy as if it were strength." "It's harder," Thalen said, "and it lasts longer." The reflection hissed. Rain began to fall again, but upward, drawn from the sand toward the clouds. The horizon shimmered with reverse gravity. Einar stumbled back. "What the hell is happening?" Thalen's voice stayed calm. "My shadow wants to see back." The reflection lunged. The waves surged upward like a column of wrath, slamming into shore with the sound of judgment. Einar fell backward, shielding his face from salt and spray. The air was alive with static, each gust of wind carrying fragments of forgotten languages. Thalen raised his hand. But this time he didn't command. He listened. The storm paused, uncertain. The sea waited, confused by its own reflection. "Go on," the shadow said. "Prove you're still divine." Thalen's answer was soft. "I'm not. That's why I win." He exhaled slowly. The water froze midair, trembling, then fell, not as destruction, but as mist, gentle, human. The reflection screamed without sound, dissolving into vapor that drifted upward, shimmering in the last light of day. When it cleared, the shore was still. Einar sat up, panting. "Are you done fighting yourself for today?" Thalen looked exhausted, not the kind of tired that lives in muscle or bone, but in memory. "No, but I think I'm learning how to lose beautifully." Einar laughed once, bitterly. "You gods and your poetic nonsense." Thalen turned to him, expression serene. "You call it nonsense. I call it surviving." That night, they sat beside a small fire, wrapped in silence thick enough to feel. The flames whispered against the wood. The sea hummed its low approval from beyond the dunes. Einar finally spoke. "If you really were a god, what's it like falling?" Thalen thought for a long time. "Like realizing the ocean never needed me to tell it how to move," he said. "It only needed me to stop holding my breath." He leaned back, closing his eyes. Maybe that's what being human is, learning to stop holding your breath. Einar poked at the fire, watching sparks rise. Then we're both still learning. Thalen smiled faintly. "Good. Maybe that's what keeps the world alive." They stayed that way for hours, two silhouettes against the restless dark. No prayers, no miracles, no divine thunder, just breathing. Far below, beneath the calm surface, the deep stirred, not in anger, but in recognition. Something vast and ancient moved, an awareness older than language, older even in Thalen's first tide. It had no face, no name, only gravity and hunger. It turns slowly, like a planet remembering its orbit. He teaches it to breathe, it thought. Then teach him what drowning feels like again. The sea shivered. At dawn, Thalen woke to the sound of seagulls arguing over fish guts on the beach. Einar snored loudly beside the ashes of their fire. He stood and walked to the shoreline. The horizon stretched endless and clean, painted with gold. The water touched his feet gently, no longer worshipping, just greeting. He smiled. The tide whispered something soft, almost shy. "Thank you," Thalen whispered back. "You're welcome." And for a moment, the waves sounded like laughter. He turned back toward the cabin, watching Einar mumble and roll over in his sleep, one hand reaching for a phantom oar. Thalen thought how strange it was that mortals so fragile and fleeting could anchor something as vast as him. He breathed deeply. The air filled him the way worship once had. Only this time it didn't hurt. He whispered to the wind, "Maybe I can learn to stay." And far out at sea, the deep whispered back, "Then teach me how." By dawn, the tide had crawled farther inland than it ever had before, not in destruction, but in curiosity. It lapped gently at the wooden posts of Einar's cabin, as though the sea itself wanted to eavesdrop. The morning light was thin and forgiving, painting everything in soft golds and silvers. The scent of wet would mix with salt and smoke. Even the air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the world to remember what it had just survived. Thalen stood barefoot in the shallows, his trousers rolled to the knee, eyes closed, listening. Every sound felt amplified. The creak of damp wood, the hush of waves dragging themselves across the sand, the whistle of the wind through reeds. Even the slow, uneven inhale of Einar sleeping inside sounded like the rhythm of something larger. The world, it seemed, had begun to match its breathing to his. Einar stumbled out into the light, hair wild, one boot in his hand and the other missing. His shirt was unbuttoned halfway down, revealing a chest marked by scars and sun. "You planning to stand there until the tide gets bored?" Thalen smiled faintly, his expression unreadable. "It won't. It's try to learn how not to take." Einar blinked. "You talk like you're teaching him manners." "Maybe I am." Thalen turned toward him, water dripping from his fingertips, light sliding across his skin like liquid glass. "The sea and I used to be the same thing. Hungry, we fed on fear, on worship. We thought that was balance." Einar squinted, the corners of his mouth twitching. "And now," Thalen looked out across the horizon, "now it's trying to understand grace." Einar stepped into the water beside him. The chill bit at his ankles, but the bite felt honest, almost affectionate. "You really think the ocean can change?" Thalen's gaze softened. "If I can breathe, it can listen." They spent the day walking the shoreline. The storm had left strange offerings, shards of glass polished into gems, shells that sang when held to the ear, and pieces of shipwrecks reassembled by the current into shapes that seemed to hover between accident and intention. A mast curved like a rib cage. A plank nailed itself upright in the sand, casting a shadow longer than the sun could explain. Children followed them from a distance, whispering, half afraid, half enchanted. The world had started treating Thalen like a rumor it wasn't sure it wanted to believe in again. One brave girl darted forward, clutching a piece of coral shaped like a heart. "Is it yours?" she asked. Thalen crouched, his voice gentle. "It used to be." He closed her small fingers around it and smiled. "Now it's yours." The girl stared up at him with wide eyes, torn between awe and confusion. Then, with a strange logic only children possess, she bowed clumsily and ran back to the others, tripping twice and laughing both times. Einar crossed his arms. "You're starting to look like a legend people actually like." Thalen tilted his head. "Do mortals always fear kindness?" "Only when it looks like magic." Thalen smiled faintly. "Maybe that's why kindness is so rare." As the day burned into evening, the horizon softened into fire. The sea mirrored it perfectly. There was no separation between sky and water, only a molten seam of light that suggested the world had briefly remembered it was whole. Thalen stopped walking. "Listen." Einar frowned. "To what?" "The deep. It's humming." Einar strained to hear, and then he did. Beneath the slow pulse of waves was a sound unlike anything living or dead, a vibration, deep and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of a sleeping god buried far below them. It wasn't loud. It was inevitable. Einar swallowed. What is that? Thalen's expression tightened. Memory. That night, the humming grew louder. It filled the air, the floorboards, the silence between thoughts. The sea glowed faintly, veins of gold and turquoise threading through it like molten light beneath glass. Even the sky seemed to pulse in rhythm. Einar couldn't sleep. The cabin shook softly with each deep vibration, as though the world itself had become a drum played by invisible hands. Thalen, he called, sitting up, whatever you're doing, stop it. No answer. He cursed under his breath and stepped outside. Thalen was standing knee-deep in the water, eyes open wide, pupils dilated until they looked bottomless. His skin shimmered faintly, each breath drawing the glow closer around him. It's not me, Thalen said, voice trembling. It's the ocean remembering. Einar's heart kicked hard. Remembering what? Thalen turned toward him, eyes full of light and sorrow. Everything. The glow deepened. Images began to rise within the water, first soft, then sharp. Faces, ships, cities swallowed by time. The silhouettes of lovers holding hands beneath the waves. Soldiers who drowned with their armor still shining. Children reaching toward the surface that never reached back. Every drowned thing the sea had ever claimed returned in light. For a heartbeat, it was beautiful. The kind of beauty that rewrites what hope means. Then it became unbearable. The glow grew too bright, too loud. The light was sound now. The sound was memory, and all of it hurt. Einar shielded his eyes. Make it stop. Thalen raised his arms, but not to command, only to steady himself. It's not meant to stop, he cried. It's confessing. The air shuddered. The light split. The sea roared, not with anger but revelation. Then, beneath the noise, came a voice not quite human and not quite divine, a voice like grief learning how to speak. Why did you leave us? Thalen's knees buckled. His voice cracked. Because I thought I was saving you. You drowned us. I drowned myself, he shouted. The waves froze mid-motion, glass towers suspended in midair. Silence fell so suddenly that it crushed the breath out of Einar's chest. Even the stars seemed to retreat, dimming at the edges. Einar took one step forward, terrified. Thalen, the god, no longer glowing, only human now, whispered, "They're right." He stepped forward into the still water. This time, it didn't devour him. It held him, trembling, unsure. Einar's voice cracked. Tell them you're sorry." Thalen's throat worked. The words came small, fragile, and infinite. I am. The light rippled. The waves shivered, as though something vast had unclenched its fists. Slowly the ocean bowed. Then it whispered, softly, tenderly, like a prayer too tired to rise. Then breathe. Thalen did. The tide moved back, not in retreat, but in relief. The water exhaled through his legs, curling around him like gratitude. When the light faded, he stood there shaking, pale and exhausted, his body flickering between divine and mortal like a candle learning restraint. Einar ran forward and caught him as he fell. "Still think you're not a god," he muttered, lowering him gently onto the sand. Thalen's voice was barely a breath. "I'm not. I'm what's left when one finally learns to mean it." By dawn, the beach was littered with driftwood and fragments of impossible things. Pearls the size of fists, shards of glass that hummed, fish that glowed faintly then faded into mist. The sea lay still, too still. Between the first gull's cry and the first gold streak of sunrise, Einar realized what was missing. The tide wasn't coming back. Thalen stirred weakly beside him. His chest rose, slow and deliberate. "It's holding its breath," he whispered. Einar frowned. "Why?" "Because it's waiting for me to tell it what to do next." Einar knelt beside him. "And..." Thalen smiled weakly, lips pale, eyes distant. "For once, I don't know." He closed his eyes. The air around him shimmered, delicate as glass. Einar looked out at the endless, breathless horizon and thought, for first time, that silence could be holy. The gulls circled higher. The world exhaled through them. And somewhere beneath the stillness, deep below where sunlight could reach, the sea, ancient, forgiven, uncertain, waited for its God to teach it what living meant when there was nothing left to fear. But Thalen did not speak again that morning. He simply lay there, eyes closed, the line between man and myth blurring like ink in a tide. Einar stayed beside him, watching the horizon for movement, counting seconds between waves that never arrived. He whispered, "You said it could learn to listen." Thalen didn't answer. Einar swallowed. "Then listen to me. Damn you. Come back." The water crept forward just far enough to touch Thalen's hand. A single ripple. Then another. Einar blinked, tears stinging. The ocean's rhythm began again, slow, cautious, uneven. The tide returned, and with it came a whisper so quiet it could have been imagination. "We're trying." Hours later, when the sun had fully risen and life resumed its usual pretense of normalcy, the villagers would say the sea looked different that day. Not calmer, exactly, more alive. Children played along the edge without fear. Fishermen felt their nets grow heavy again. The gulls sang until dusk, and out beyond the shore, where the water darkened to its endless blue, something vast and ancient turned over in its sleep. Content, curious, learning. The ocean was breathing again, and though no one else could hear it, Thalen smiled faintly in his sleep, as if answering a question only the sea could have asked. The morning that followed was heavy with waiting, the kind of waiting that thickens the air, that presses down on the skin, and makes every sound arrive late, as if time itself were unsure whether to continue. Even the gulls refused to cry. The world stood still, not dead, but listening. Einar stood at the edge of the water, hands on his hips, staring at the horizon that refused to rise or fall. The tide sat motionless, flat as a held breath, as though the sea had turned into a single thought it couldn't finish thinking. "You broke it," he muttered, squinting into the blinding silver of dawn. "You taught it stillness too well." Behind him, Thalen lay in the damp sand, eyes half open, his skin pale and gray with exhaustion. His chest rose and fell in slow, uneven intervals, like a broken clock trying to remember rhythm. The sea reflected his weakness. Its pulse gone, its voice stolen. Einar crouched beside him. "You said it was waiting for you." Thalen nodded faintly. "It always waited for me." His voice was hoarse, threadbare. "That's the problem." "Then tell it to move," Einar said, a note of impatience curling into his tone. Thalen's gaze drifted toward the sky, faded blue streaked with pink. "I told it to listen," he murmured. "It's doing exactly that." A shiver passed through the ground beneath them. The water darkened, mirroring the color of Thalen's eyes. Stormlight without the storm. It pulsed once, deep and slow, in perfect sync with his heartbeat. Einar took a step back. No. Don't you start tying yourself back to it. You said you wanted to live, remember?" Thalen sat up slowly, his body trembling from the effort. "If I don't, it'll suffocate. And if you do..." Einar's voice was sharp, but beneath it was fear. The kind of fear that only comes from watching something divine teeter on the edge of being human. Thalen looked at him, expression almost tender. "Then maybe we'll both remember how to live." By midday, the stillness had become unbearable. The villagers had gathered along the cliffs and the beach, wrapped in cloaks and silence. They didn't speak or point. They only stared at the unmoving ocean, the one they had always trusted to move. Boats had stranded in the shallows, their hulls creaking in confusion. Nets hung from posts like cobwebs abandoned by the wind. Even the children, those who never learned reverence for anything, sat quietly, wide-eyed. The air was thick with waiting, the kind of waiting that makes hearts beat louder than waves. Einar trudged down the slope again, his boots sinking deep into the wet sand. His jaw clenched so tight it ached. "You can't keep everyone waiting for you to breathe," he said when he reached Thalen. Thalen stood barefoot in the surf, unmoving, the water around him frozen, as if unwilling to touch him without permission. "That's all any god ever did," he said softly. "We breathed for others until they forgot how." "Well, they're remembering now," Einar snapped. "So start teaching instead of performing. that earned a faint smile, one that still carried the echo of eternity, though dulled by humility. You sound like the sea when it's angry. I sound like a man who wants to fish again. Thalen almost laughed, the sound like wind brushing over still water. Then I'll see what I can do for your appetite. He turned toward the horizon. If I breathe, it'll follow me again. Then make it follow for the right reason, Einar said. Thalen closed his eyes. The world seemed to shrink to a single inhale. And then, at last, he exhaled. The air trembled. The water rippled once. Then again, slowly, carefully, the tide began to move, not with rage or vengeance, but with rhythm. The first small wave curled around Einar's boots, soft and familiar, like an apology that didn't need words. From the cliffs, a collective gasp rose. Someone began to cry. Another began to pray. Thalen swayed, his legs buckling. "It's breathing again," he whispered. Einar caught him before he fell. "You did it." Thalen shook his head. "No, we did it. Listen." The sea responded with a long, low sigh that rolled across the shore like forgiveness. The air filled with salt and warmth. The wind returned, brushing through their hair with the softness of recognition. Above them, far out beyond the horizon, a whale sang, a sound so deep it felt like the earth humming in gratitude. That night, the village celebrated, though no one called it that aloud. Fires were lit along the beach. Nets were repaired. Laughter returned like a timid animal, learning it was safe to emerge again. Einar sat by the fire outside his cabin, the flames painting his face in shifting gold. Inside, Thalen slept soundly for the first time in days. His breathing matched the hush of the waves beyond the dunes. For the first time in a long time, Einar let himself breathe without checking whether the sea would answer. He stared into the fire, shaking his head. "You really did it, you stubborn bastard." A soft voice interrupted him. "You talk to him like he's just another man." Einar looked up. The baker from the village stood in the doorway, holding a small loaf wrapped in cloth. She was a sturdy woman, with flour dusted in her hair, and a face both kind and skeptical. "He's worse than a man," Einar said. "He's a reminder." "Of what?" "That everything powerful forgets how to be kind until it learns hunger." She stepped closer, placing the bread by the fire. "And you? What did you learn?" Einar looked at Thalen's sleeping form through the window. "That maybe gods aren't supposed to save us. Maybe they're just meant to show us how to start over." At dawn, Thalen woke to rain. Not the harsh, endless kind he once commanded, but soft, playful drops that tapped against the roof like curious fingers. The smell of wet earth drifted through the open door, fresh and forgiving. He stepped outside barefoot, letting the sand swallow his feet. The sea greeted him with a single wave, small, deliberate, curling just enough to touch his ankles before retreating. "Good morning," he whispered. The ocean whispered back, the voice faint but clear, rippling through the foam. "You're quieter now." "So are you," Thalen said. "We don't need to shout anymore." He smiled faintly, closing his eyes. "No, we finally learned to listen." Einar emerged a moment later, yawning, hair sticking up in wild angles. "If the sea starts talking again, tell it to keep the volume down." Thalen laughed, a sound like foam against stone, endless and gentle. "It's learning." Einar squinted at him. "So what now? You're going back under?" Thalen shook his head. "No, I think I'll stay where the waves can reach me, but not take me. Half god, half fool then. Perfect balance," Thalen said, grinning. The rain slowed. The first light of day stretched across the water, turning it molten gold. For a long while, they stood there, two figures side by side, saying nothing. The ocean breathed with them, steady, alive, healed. But peace, Thalen knew, was never permanent. That night, as he slept in the cabin, he dreamed of the deep. It called to him not with rage, but with longing. He left us unled. It said, voice like pressure, like distance. "We are moving, but without purpose. Without tide, chaos waits." Thalen answered in the dream, "Then find your own rhythm." "You are the rhythm," it said. "Without you, we forget the difference between silence and sleep." He awoke, gasping, drenched in sweat, the taste of salt in his mouth. Einar was snoring in the next room. The fire burned low, and outside, the sea murmured, restless. He stepped outside, the night air cool and damp. The stars shimmered above the waves, their reflections trembling. "I told you to listen," he whispered, "not to wait." The tide answered with sound like laughter and weeping combined. Days passed. The ocean moved again, cautiously, tentatively. It followed the moon, relearning the art of obedience. The fishermen returned to their boats. The bakers' laughter came back to the marketplace. The children swam in the shallows, shouting Thalin's name as if invoking a spell. Einar fixed his nets, humming tunelessly. Thalin often helped, though he was clumsy. Hands more used to shaping storms than tying knots. "You're terrible at this," Einar said one afternoon as Thalin tangled yet another rope. "I'm better at unmaking things," Thalin replied. "That's not comforting." "I didn't mean it to be." They laughed then, long and real. Yet at night, when the village slept, Thalin walked the shoreline alone. The sea watched him, rippling faintly in the moonlight. "You're afraid," he said quietly. The water shimmered, forming faint patterns like breath on glass. "We remember drowning." "You always will," Thalin said. "Memory is what keeps you gentle." "And you? Do you remember us?" He smiled sadly. "I remember everything. That's my curse." "No," the sea replied softly. "It's our gift." The next storm came months later. Not a violent one, but steady and vast. Rain swept across the ocean in endless curtains, and lightning flickered far off where the horizon vanished. Einar stood by the window. "Think it's for you?" Thalin's smile was small. "Maybe it's for itself." The storm lasted 3 days. When it ended, the beaches glittered with glass again, the ocean breathing evenly. The villagers began to whisper that the world felt balanced now, that even the wind had stopped quarreling with the trees. Thalin, sitting on the porch, only said, "Balance isn't peace. It's practice." As the years passed, he changed. The divine glow faded until only a trace remained, visible only at dawn, when his eyes caught the light of the sea. His hands grew callous from mending nets. His back bent slightly with the labor of living. He learned to curse at splinters, to laugh at burnt bread, to hum while he worked. And yet, sometimes, when storms gathered far beyond the horizon, the waves would whisper his name, not as prayer, but as greeting. He would nod toward the water and whisper back, "Keep breathing." One night, many years later, when the moon was red and full, Einar found him sitting on the beach, staring at the horizon. "You look tired," Einar said, sitting beside him. "I am," Thalin admitted, "but not the way I used to be." The sea's calm tonight. It learned well. They sat in silence for a while, watching the gentle rise and fall of the tide. Einar cleared his throat. "You ever miss it? Being what you were?" Thalin smiled faintly. "Sometimes. But then I remember what it felt like to be worshipped. And—" He looked at him. "It felt like drowning." Einar laughed quietly. "You're the only god I've ever met who preferred fishing to prayers." "That's because fishing is honest," Thalin said. "You throw something of yourself into the deep and hope it comes back changed." Einar nodded. "That's life too." Thalin smiled. "Exactly." Years blurred into seasons. Einar grew older, slower, but still stubborn. The villagers began telling stories to their children about the man who taught the sea to breathe. Some said he was still alive. Others said he had turned into the tide itself. No one knew for sure. But sometimes, when dawn broke just right and the first light hit the water, the waves seemed to rise a little higher, as if bowing in greeting. And far out at sea, in the place where the horizon folded into eternity, a voice whispered, faint, familiar, endlessly patient. Finally, it said, "He remembers why we loved him." The sea stayed calm for 7 days. Too calm. By the 8th, Thalin began to feel it. The ache of still water somewhere far away. The pull of rivers that hadn't yet learned the rhythm of forgiveness. It started as a pressure behind his eyes, like a tide trapped inside his skull. Then it became a whisper. "Come back to us." Einar noticed before Thalin said a word. "You're hearing them again, aren't you?" Thalin nodded slowly. Not the sea. The rivers. They don't know I'm different yet. Einar groaned, already sensing the shape of the inevitable. So what? We pack up and go tell the rivers you're sorry now. Thalen smiled faintly. You make it sound absurd. It is absurd. Einar pointed toward the ocean. You just taught that thing to breathe. Can't it send a memo upstream? The sea forgives, Thalen said. The rivers remember. By noon they were walking inland, following a path carved by rain through black pine and moss. The air smelled different here. Less salt, more earth, like the world's pulse is slow to think. Birds sang nervously, aware that something divine had chosen to travel on foot. Thalen kept glancing at puddles, watching the reflections move slower than they should. Once, when he stepped over a stream, the water trembled and whispered his name. He winced. You can stop doing that, Einar muttered. It's unnerving when the mud talks to you. They're not talking to me, Thalen said. They're trying to remember what I looked like before I drowned them. Einar stopped walking. You mean you flooded this far inland? Thalen's silence was answer enough. They reached the first river by nightfall. It wasn't large, just a ribbon of silver twisting through a bed of stones, but it glowed faintly in the dark, as if lit from within. The current slowed when Thalen approached. The air turned cold. The sound of frogs and crickets faded until all that remained was the hush of water, moving against itself. Thalen knelt at the bank. You remember me, he said softly. The river replied in a low murmur that was more feeling than sound. You burned us with salt. I did, he said, because I thought the sea needed to own everything that moved. It does not. No, he agreed. It never did. I just couldn't bear to be small. The river hissed, the current twisting violently for a moment before calming again. You asked for forgiveness? Thalen looked up at the stars reflected in the water. No, he said. I asked for permission to listen. The water paused, uncertain. Then, slowly, the current began to change direction, flowing backward toward the sea. Einar gasped. What did you just do? Thalen stood, voice trembling with awe. It's remembering how to return. They followed the river downstream for 3 days. Everywhere they went, the water mirrored them too closely. Lakes rippled in greeting. Streams formed new paths where none had existed. The land itself seemed to sigh under the weight of recognition. On the third night, they stopped in a small village built on stilts above a swamp. The people there eyed Thalen with the quiet wariness of those who suspect myth hides in the shape of men. One old woman approached him, her back bent like a question mark. You're the one the rivers whisper about, she said. Thalen bowed his head. They remember too much. Water never forgets, she said, then touched his wrist with a hand, so cold it could have been carved from the river itself. But it can be taught to love again. She led him to the edge of the swamp, where the still water reflected the moon perfectly. Put your hand in, she said. Thalen hesitated. Einar stood behind him, ready to grab him if the water tried anything poetic and dangerous at once. When his fingers touched the surface, it didn't ripple. It sang. A low, mournful hum vibrated up his arm, through his chest, into the sky. The reflection of the moon split and reformed, now showing 2 shapes instead of one bright, one faint. Thalen whispered, the drowned and the living. The old woman smiled faintly. Now both can float. The swamp glowed around them, each droplet of mist rising like a spirit. The villagers fell to their knees, not in fear, but in release. Einar's jaw dropped. You're fixing the world's plumbing with emotions. Thalen chuckled softly. Maybe redemption is just maintenance. That night, while the village slept, Einar woke to find Thalen standing ankle-deep in the glowing swamp, staring up at the stars. You're thinking about going back, aren't you? He asked quietly. Thalen didn't turn. The sea called me once. Now the rivers do. But maybe it isn't about going anywhere. Maybe it's about letting everywhere meet halfway. Einar joined him, the mud cold around his feet. You mean balance. I mean surrender, Thalen said. The kind that doesn't end things, just lets them flow. The river hummed again, this time softer, like a child falling asleep. Thalen's reflection looked almost human now, tired, flawed, alive. Einar, he murmured, do you ever wonder what happens to gods when they finally learn humility? Einar smiled faintly. I think they start telling the truth. And what truth is that? That nobody ever needed them to be gods in the first place. Thalen laughed quietly, the sound blending with the rippling water. Then I'm finally becoming honest. He reached into the current, and the river brightened. The tide in the distance stirred in response, as if hearing its own name. Einar watched, all softening into something gentler. Respect. You really are teaching the world to breathe. Thalen looked at him, the glow of the swamp reflected in his eyes. No, he said, it's teaching me. And for the first time since his fall, he looked peaceful. The water around him whispered like prayer. The night exhaled, and somewhere deep beneath the soil, the sea turned over in its sleep and smiled. By the time they reached the highlands, the rivers had learned to speak without shouting. They no longer roared or thundered down from the cliffs as they once had, when storms were gods and every drop of rain was a hymn of conquest. Now they hummed softly, whispering to moss and roots, carrying secrets in ripples too small for power to notice. The land here breathed differently, quiet, deliberate, ancient. The air itself seemed thinner, lighter, as though afraid of interrupting the conversation between earth and sky. Even the clouds drifted slower, moving like creatures reluctant to leave the peace below. Einar trudged ahead along a narrow dirt path, balancing a bundle of fish on his shoulder and cursing under his breath. You know, he said over his shoulder, when I agreed to follow a washed-up god, I didn't think it'd involve so much walking. Thalen, who had not stopped since dawn, smiled faintly. The sea's patience doesn't end at its edge. Tell that to my feet, Einar muttered. They stopped believing in patience 3 mountains ago. Thalen didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the mountains rose like teeth against the pale sky. Somewhere beyond them, the rivers met the clouds, the birthplace of rain, the first covenant between heaven and the earth. He could feel the pull of it deep in his bones, not as a command but as a memory, a place that remembered him before he learned shame. They climbed for hours, until the land opened into a plateau that overlooked the valley below. From there, the rivers looked like threads of silver light weaving to the green expanse, stitching the world together. It was beautiful, too beautiful to trust. Thalen sat near the edge of the cliff, legs dangling over nothingness. The wind tugged at his hair, carrying the scent of pine and distance. When I first made the flood, he said quietly, I thought I was cleansing the world. Einar dropped a bundle of fish beside him and sat down. You were drowning it instead. I was teaching it fear. Why? Thalen's answer came after a long pause. Because I was afraid first. The words hung between them, heavy as rain before a storm. Einar didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't. The wind shifted, and in the soft rush of air, there came another sound, a low murmur, familiar and feminine, like a wave folding in on itself. Thalen froze, his head tilted slightly, eyes widening as if he'd heard a language he hadn't spoken in ages. She's here. Who? Einar asked, half joking, half afraid. The first river. The sky dimmed, not with clouds or storm, but with presence. The air thickened, pressing down on their lungs, and the sound of rushing water echoed from every direction at once. Then the ground trembled. From the valley below, a column of mist rose, coiling upward until it took shape, a vast figure of flowing water and light. She towered above them, her form fluid, translucent, and radiant. Her hair cascaded like waterfalls. Her skin shimmered with reflections of every river that ever was. Her eyes were clear and endless, like windows into motion itself. Her voice rolled across the plateau, low and resonant, the sound of mountains remembering rain. You remember me at last, Thalen. Thalen stood, breath trembling. A quail. You taught me hunger, she said. You carved valleys with grief and filled them with your sorrow. And now you come wearing skin. Asking what? Forgiveness? Thalen lowered his head. No. I came to see what you became when I stopped pretending I owned you. The river goddess tilted her head. Every shift in her form reshaped the valley below. Streams twisting, trees bending toward her voice. You left us leaderless. We almost became still. Thalen stepped closer, the wind pulling his hair into wild strands. Then you learned what stillness was for. Aquail's expression softened, though her tone remained sharp. Mortality has made you clever. Thalen smiled faintly. Mortality has made me small enough to hear you. For a long moment, nothing moved but the wind. Then Aquail reached out, her hand forming from rain and mist. Her fingers brushed Thalen's chest, and the air rippled outward in shimmering waves. He gasped, knees buckling slightly as light spilled from the point of contact. Einar staggered backward, shouting, "What are you doing?" "Listening," she said. "He carries echoes of what we were. The ocean's pulse, the first movement." Her eyes glowed brighter. "You made us restless, Thalen. You made us alive, and then you drowned that gift in guilt." He met her gaze. "Then take it back. Take what I stole." Aquail's expression softened into something that looked heartbreakingly human. "I cannot. You made us too much like yourself." She leaned closer, her voice a whisper of rain. "But I can remind you of what you forgot." Her palm pressed to his forehead. Light exploded, pure, golden, endless. The earth shook. The rivers below surged upward like serpents of flame and silver. Einar shouted his name, but his voice was devoured by the storm of sound and brilliance. For an instant, the world seemed to dissolve into water and light. The rivers glowed white, then gold, then a deep, living blue, and then silence. When the glow faded, Aquail was gone. Only Thalen remained, kneeling, trembling, steam rising from his skin. Einar ran to him. "You alive?" Thalen's voice was distant, hollow with wonder. "She showed me." "Showed you what?" He looked up, eyes shining like sunlight reflected off waves. "What the world looked like before I made fear." That night, they camped near a small waterfall that fed a clear pool. The air smelled of moss and lightning. Thalen sat by the water's edge, staring into the reflection that wavered between human and divine. His fingers brushed the surface absently, tracing circles that glowed faintly before fading. Einar sat nearby, chewing on dried fish. "You're quiet." "I remember the first dawn," Thalen said softly. "Before gods, before tides. The light didn't know it was light yet. It just touched things and they woke." He smiled faintly. Everything was soft then. Nothing demanded to be worshipped. Einar looked at him. "You sound homesick." "Maybe I am, for a world that never needed me." He reached into the pool, letting the cool water run through his fingers. The ripples shimmered, forming faint images. Mountains before rivers, sky before rain, hands weaving streams like silk threads across the newborn earth. "Aquail isn't angry anymore," Thalen murmured. "She's sad. She remembers what we could have been." Einar shrugged, pulling his coat tighter. "Then make it better now." Thalen shook his head. "You can't repair creation. You can only teach it mercy." The pool darkened, reflecting stars instead of sky. The air vibrated faintly as though listening. For the first time, Einar felt something like worship that wasn't fear. He spoke quietly. "You're doing it again, aren't you? Changing the world." Thalen smiled, faint and human. "No, I'm letting it change me." When dawn came, the rivers reversed their flow, not in defiance, but in joy. The mountains sang as their streams shimmered gold, the sunlight turning water into liquid music. The sound echoed through valleys and plains, reaching even the faraway ocean. And somewhere deep beneath the waves, the sea stirred, not in jealousy, but in recognition. "He's learning," it whispered. Days passed, and they journeyed higher into the highlands. The world around them grew quieter, as though thinning toward purity. Trees gave way to stone, stone to snow, and snow to mist. Einar stepped slowed, his breath visible in the cold air. "Remind me again why we're climbing toward the sky." Thalen's eyes were distant. "Because that's where the rain begins. I need to see if the sky remembers me too." They reached a ridge where the air thinned into blue crystal. Clouds drifted below them like rivers of mist. For a long moment, Einar forgot to breathe. Thalen stood at the summit, his hair whipping in the wind. "This is where the first water fell," he whispered, "where motion was born." The sky darkened, not with storm but with memory. A single drop of rain formed above his head, glowing faintly as it fell onto his palm. It pulsed once alive. Einar watched, awestruck. "What is that?" Thalen smiled. "The beginning." He lifted the drop toward the air, releasing it. It rose instead of falling, joining the clouds again like a seed returning to its tree. The world sighed. Far below, the rivers shimmered in response, and the ocean lifted its tides in gentle applause. That night, they made camp near the edge of a glacier. The ice beneath them hummed softly, ancient voices trapped within it whispering as they melted. Thalen lay awake long after Einar had fallen asleep. The stars above him seemed closer here, each one a pulse, a memory, a note in a song. He was only just remembering. He whispered into the dark, "Aquail, are you still listening?" The wind answered, carrying the faint scent of rain. Always came her voice, soft as mist. "You finally understand what it means to flow." Thalen closed his eyes, smiling. "I think I do." "Then rest," she said. "Tomorrow, the rivers will teach you what forgiveness sounds like." When dawn came, the rivers had changed again. They no longer ran toward the ocean in haste. They lingered, coiling through meadows, feeding roots in valleys, as if savoring the journey. Birds followed their curves, singing in harmony with the new rhythm. The world felt patient. Einar stood beside Thalen, watching the transformation unfold below. "You see that?" he asked. "They're not racing anymore." Thalen nodded. "They've learned to arrive without leaving." Einar chuckled. "You make everything sound poetic. You know that, right?" "It's the only language the world remembers," Thalen said quietly. That evening, as they descended the last ridge toward the lowlands, rain began to fall, gentle, golden rain that smelled faintly of salt. The rivers answered in song. The ocean stirred in its cradle. And far across the world, in the deep that had once been Thalen's throne, the sea whispered with something like pride. "He's learning." The waves echoed it, carrying the words across endless water, until even the wind began to hum along. And above it all, in the quiet heart of the mountains, where rivers were born and gods came to remember, Thalen stood beside Einar, eyes closed, smiling. For the first time since creation began, the world wasn't worshiping. It was listening, and that, Thalen realized, was the closest thing to divinity left. When the rivers began to sing, the gods finally noticed. It started quietly, a vibration that ran beneath the mountains, threading through the roots of trees, echoing in the lungs of men. Those who still prayed at dawn found their words answered not by thunder, but by warmth. The rain fell differently now, as if each drop had made its own decision to descend. In the high heavens, where storms were born and pride never aged, the old gods stirred. They had been silent since Thalen's fall, content to watch the world struggle and call it balance. But this harmony felt wrong to them. A world that breathed without asking permission, that was blasphemy. So they sent someone to remind it how to kneel. Thalen didn't know any of this yet. He stood by the edge of a cliff, eyes closed, letting the morning wind dry the rain from his hair. The rivers below glimmered in gold and silver threads. He could feel the earth's pulse beneath his bare feet, calm and deliberate. Einar approached, chewing on a piece of dried fruit. "You look peaceful. I don't trust it." Thalen smiled faintly. "You trust nothing you can't fight." "Exactly." The god looked back at the valley. "Then maybe peace is the bravest thing we've done." Einar was about to reply when the air behind them shifted. Not the way wind moves, but the way time does when it decides to pay attention. A shadow fell across the ground, tall, sharp-edged, shimmering like molten glass. Thalen turned slowly. She was beautiful in the way storms are before they break. Her skin shimmered like cloudlight, her eyes twin cyclones of pale blue. Her voice, when it came, was soft enough to cut stone. "Thalen." Einar stepped instinctively between them. "And you are—" The woman didn't look at him. "He knows." Thalen inclined his head. Ira, Ira, the Wind Mother, goddess of tempests, keep her balance, his oldest friend and the first to cast him down. I heard the rivers singing, she said. I thought it was a mistake. They're learning forgiveness, he answered. She circled him slowly, bare feet never touching the ground. Forgiveness isn't balance. Maybe balance was just control with better manners. Her smile was almost kind. You've grown poetic in exile. Mortality forces creativity. Mortality, she repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. You've contaminated creation. It used to fear us. Now it feels. That isn't order. It's life. Ira tilted her head. Life is noise. Thalen's gaze was steady. Then maybe silence was overrated. Einar muttered under his breath. She's charming. Ira's eyes flicked toward him, and the air around his throat tightened just enough to make him shut up. You taught the sea to breathe, she said. You made the rivers sing. What next? The sky learned to cry. Thalen's expression softened. Yes, and maybe the gods learned to listen. The wind rose violent now. You were never meant to change the design. I didn't, he said. I forgave it. Ira's patience snapped. You forgave yourself. Finally, he whispered. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The storm hovered at the edge of her fingertips, waiting for permission. But she hesitated. Thalen's calm unnerved her. Once, she'd known him as a sea that devoured ships. Now he was something else entirely. Quieter, heavier, dangerous in a gentler way. Why are you here, really? He asked. Ira's eyes darkened. Because the others are waking, and they remember what you cost us. What I cost you was fear. What you gave us was consequence. Then maybe it's time you face both. Her expression faltered. You think you can stand against us? I think I can stand with them. He nodded toward the valley, where rivers and forests shimmered as though listening. The world isn't yours to govern anymore. It's learning to speak in its own voice. Ira stepped closer, her storm swirling around them. You sound human. Thank you. Lightning cracked across the horizon. She flinched first, anger flickering through her face like static. They'll come for you. Thalen didn't move. Then I'll teach them to breathe too. The wind broke suddenly, scattering leaves, lifting Ira's hair in a wild halo. She stared at him one last time, something between pity and disbelief in her eyes, then vanished, leaving only the faint smell of rain and defiance. Einar exhaled. I liked her. No, you didn't. True, but I like watching someone hate you more than I do. Thalen laughed softly. She doesn't hate me. She mourns a version of me that made her feel safe. And the others? They won't mourn. They'll punish. Einar folded his arms. Then what's the plan? Thalen looked at the rivers below. The plan, he said, is to make sure punishment finally looks like mercy. The wind shifted again, gentler now, almost curious. Somewhere far above, thunder rolled like a slow heartbeat, ancient and afraid. The gods had begun to stir. And this time, the world wasn't kneeling. By the third morning after Ira's visit, the sky had begun to look uneasy. The clouds were too still. The light bent strangely, as if afraid to touch the earth. Birds flew lower, their wings trembling against the thick air. Even the rivers had grown hesitant, their songs reduced to murmurs. Einar noticed it first. The world feels like it's holding its breath again. Thalen didn't answer. He was standing at the edge of a meadow, barefoot, staring at the horizon where a dark shape flickered in and out of sight. Not a storm, not a mountain, something alive. It's him, he said quietly. Who's him? Thalen's tone darkened. The first judgment. The shape became clearer as approached. A giant made of stone and gold veins, taller than any temple, eyes like furnaces. Each step it took sank into the soil, leaving behind smoking footprints that filled instantly with molten light. When it finally stopped before them, the world seemed to tilt in acknowledgement. Einar couldn't breathe. The giant's voice was slow, resonant, terrible. Thalen of the deep. The name echoed, twisting through the valley, carried by wind and water alike. I see your name still carries weight. Einar muttered under his breath. The giant ignored him. You once ruled with tide and judgment. You drowned the proud. You silenced the gods who mocked your flood. Do you remember me? Thalen nodded slowly. I remember your fear. You were stone when I was wave. I broke you once. The giant leaned closer. You will not break me again. I'm not here to. Then what are you? Thalen looked at the grass between them. Green, trembling, still alive under the weight of the god's shadow. Something you've never been. Forgiven. The giant's face cracked with heat. Forgiveness is weakness. Then weakness built this world, Thalen said, because mercy made the first dawn rise. Einar took a cautious step back. You sure you want to antagonize the walking volcano? Thalen didn't answer. The air had begun to hum, vibrating with the tension of two opposing truths colliding. The giant raised one massive hand, light pulsing beneath its skin. If mercy is power, prove it. Thalen didn't move. I don't prove. I endure. The hand came down. The earth split open with a roar that could have undone creation itself. Trees disintegrated into ash. Rivers boiled. Einar was thrown backward, his vision blinding white. But in the heart of that impossible heat, Thalen stood unmoving. When the light faded, the ground beneath him was untouched. The fire had curved around him, refusing to consume. Even the wind had gone still in confusion. The giant staggered back. What did you do? Thalen's voice was calm. I let it burn what I used to be. He raised his hand slowly, palm open. The flames around him shrank, cooling into small sparks that floated upward like fireflies. When they touched the sky, they turned to rain. The giant watched as the rain fell on his stone shoulders, steam rising where it touched. For the first time, he looked smaller. You took my fire. Thalen shook his head. I gave it back meaning. The rain turned golden. It fell softly, coating the valley in warmth instead of destruction. The grass sprouted through the cracks, flowers opening in seconds where ash had been. The smell of ozone became the smell of life. Einar slowly sat up, soaked and blinking. You're telling me mercy wins fights now? Thalen smiled faintly. It doesn't win. It ends a need for them. The giant stared at him for a long time. His furnace eyes dimmed. You are no longer one of us. I never was, Thalen said. I just pretended louder. The giant stepped back, his form beginning to crumble into dust and gold. Then you have unmade the order. Maybe I've made it honest. The wind rose again, lifting the golden dust into the sky, scattering it across the clouds. For a moment, the light above shimmered with strange, tender radiance, like dawn learning humility. Einar stood beside him. You keep doing this thing where everything terrifying ends up crying. Thalen looked up at the golden sky. Tears are just water that remembers its way home. That evening, as they walked toward the next valley, the rivers ran warmer. Birds sang louder. Even the soil seemed to breathe with relief. But Thalen's expression was troubled. Einar noticed. You won, didn't you? There are no victories, Thalen said. Only echoes. Of what? He stopped walking, listening to the distant thunder. Of gods learning they can bleed. Later, when the stars returned, Thalen sat by the river alone. The reflection that stared back at him was not the god he used to be. His skin shimmered faintly with light, but his eyes were older, quieter. In the reflection beside him appeared another figure. Not Einar, not a quail, not Ira. Something vast and familiar. It spoke in a voice that was neither male nor female. Soft as surf over sand. You are changing the shape of heaven, Thalen whispered. Heaven never fit, right anyway. They will fear you, then they're still learning. The reflection smiled, or the water made it look like it did. So are you. And when it faded, Thalen realized the river had changed course again. This time, not backward, but in a perfect circle, returning to its own beginning. Clever, he murmured. Even water can forgive itself. The rain didn't stop for 3 days. It wasn't violent, just endless, gentle, relentless. It soaked the mountains, filled the valleys, and blurred the horizon until sky and earth seemed to have given up pretending to be different things. Einar stood under a ledge, soaked to the bone, staring at Thalen, who sat cross-legged in the mud like a man waiting for judgment. "You're doing it again," Einar muttered. "Doing what?" "Thinking so hard the weather starts taking notes." Thalen smiled faintly, but his eyes were far away. "The world's breathing too fast. The balance is trembling. Every god that sleeps is beginning to stir. And that's bad, I assume?" "It depends," Thalen said. "Some will wake curious. Some will wake hungry." Lightning flared across the sky, not in streaks but in branching circles, like veins pulsing in heaven's skin. The thunder that followed had rhythm, a drumbeat, purpose. "They're calling council," Thalen murmured. "Council?" Einar asked. "Like a meeting? Like a war that still believes it's polite?" By nightfall, the rain had thinned to mist. The air shimmered faintly with gold, the last gift of the giant who'd learned humility. But the glow was being swallowed by something darker that rolled across the valley, fog that moved against the wind. Shapes formed within it. Dozens, then hundreds. They weren't all gods. Some were the remains of what gods had once created. Spirits of stone, half-forgotten winds, voices that belonged to prayers abandoned mid-sentence. They gathered around Thalen in a widening circle, silent but heavy with expectation. At their center, a throne took shape, not built, but remembered. Einar whispered, "That can't be good." Thalen rose slowly. His feet left no imprint in the mud. "They've chosen their judge." The mist parted, and a woman stepped forward. Her robe was woven from night itself. Stars clung to its folds like memories. Her eyes were hollow yet endless, reflecting everything that had ever been lost. "Mother of Endings," Thalen breathed. She nodded. "You still remember my name." Einar looked between them. "You two dated or something?" Her gaze flicked toward him. "Mortal." Einar raised his hands. "Just checking the vibe." Thalen stepped closer. "Why are you here?" "To watch the end of your heresy." "I'm not ending anything." Her voice was cool, like the moment before sleep. "You are teaching creation to forgive itself. That is not our design. Maybe it's time the design evolved." Her expression didn't change, but the stars within her cloak dimmed slightly. "You speak as though you've forgotten what you were made for." "I remember too well," Thalen said. "I was made to judge. I just never realized judgment could be kind." The circle of spirits shivered. The air grew thick enough to taste, like metal and thunder. "You broke fear," she said. "Without fear there is no reverence. Without reverence there is no order. Then maybe order should never have been built on fear." The Mother of Endings lifted her hand. The ground trembled, splitting open into rivers of light. "And what would you build it on?" Thalen's voice was quiet but steady. "Understanding. Understanding breeds disobedience. Only to cruelty." Something passed through her expression, doubt, perhaps, or memory. It was gone in a heartbeat. "You have poisoned the waters. The sea no longer prays. The rivers no longer beg. The heavens themselves hesitate to thunder." "They're alive," Thalen said simply. "They don't need permission to exist anymore." She extended her hand, palm outward. "Then I will erase what you've made before it learns to erase us." Lightning struck the ground behind her, carving a circle of burning white. The spirits moved as one, their voices merging into a single, terrible chant. Einar grabbed Thalen's arm. "You said you didn't fight anymore." Thalen's eyes glowed faintly gold. "I didn't say I wouldn't protect." The chant grew louder, vibrating the air until the world itself seemed to shiver. The earth split again, light bursting through in cracks. From it rose shapes, ancient, immense, screaming with divine instinct. But Thalen didn't raise his hand. He inhaled. The light faltered. He exhaled. The sound of his breath rolled outward like a wave. It wasn't wind. It wasn't thunder. It was something older, the sigh of a tide retreating to spare what it could. The light dimmed. The spirits wavered. "You're defying inevitability," the Mother of Endings whispered. Thalen's voice trembled. "I'm redefining it." She stepped forward, fury breaking through her composure. "You would give gods a sickness of empathy. I would give them the cure." For a heartbeat, the air went still. Then the stars within her cloak began to flicker violently. "You'll unmake us all." Thalen met her gaze. Then perhaps we needed unmaking. The explosion of light that followed wasn't destruction. It was revelation. The heavens fractured, not shattering, but unfolding. Rivers of gold and silver light spilled downward like veins reconnecting after centuries of disuse. The earth didn't burn, it breathed. Einar shielded his eyes. When he opened them, the field was empty. The throne had vanished. The spirits were gone. The fog had lifted. Only Thalen remained, kneeling in the wet grass, trembling, his breath visible in the cooling air. "Thalen?" Einar asked softly. The god looked up, eyes dim but peaceful. "It's done." "What is?" "The old order." "And the mother of endings?" Thalen smiled faintly. She learned she wasn't one. By dawn, the rain stopped. The first sunlight broke through the clouds like forgiveness, finally remembering where it belonged. Einar sat beside Thalen, both of them silent. The world felt heavier, but in a way that made sense, like a body remembering gravity after floating too long. Thalen whispered, "When gods learn mercy, creation begins again." Einar sighed. "I really wish you'd write these things down. Mortals need instructions, you know." Thalen chuckled. "They don't need them. They just need time." "And you?" He looked at the rising sun, its reflection rippling across the rivers below. "I think I've finally earned my own breath." The world woke differently. It didn't roar or tremble or blaze. It sighed, the kind of sound you hear after a long cry, when grief finally unclenches and remembers what silence is for. The first to notice were the farmers. They woke to find their fields blooming where nothing had been planted. Crops grew out of rhythm, barley bending under the weight of gold before its time, blossoms rising through snow as though spring had simply decided to skip the waiting. Then came the storms. They didn't destroy any more. They arrived singing, low, melodic, as though thunder had been taught harmony. The people listened, afraid at first, then moved to tears by something they couldn't name. And everywhere, across villages and cities, dreams changed. Mortals slept and saw gods crying. Einar didn't sleep much at all. He sat outside their makeshift shelter, an old fishing hut miles from the sea, watching the horizon flicker in strange new colors. "You know," he said, "most people prefer their miracles subtle." Thalen was sitting nearby, half shrouded in shadow, watching the same sky. "Most people never had to live through gods discovering guilt." "Fair point." Einar rubbed his temples. "You realize they're going to come after you again, right? The rest of them. The ones who still think mercy is bad for business." Thalen smiled faintly. "I'm counting on it." "You're what?" "Rebellion spreads faster when authority panics." Einar groaned. "You sound like someone who's enjoying this." "I'm not," Thalen said softly, "but I am proud of them." "The gods." "No, the mortals. They're adapting. They're praying without fear." Einar threw a small stone into fire. "That's because the last thing they prayed to started fishing with them." They traveled inland again, following the song of rivers that no longer begged for the sea. They crossed forests that glowed faintly under moonlight, trees bending their branches in quiet rhythm as if keeping time with something unseen. At the third village they passed, a child ran to them holding a bowl of rainwater. "The sky's crying," she said wide-eyed, "but it's warm now." Thalen knelt, touched the bowl, and smiled. "Then the world is healing." The villagers whispered as they watched him go. Some bowed. Others simply reached out their hands, not to worship, but to touch the passing of something holy that didn't demand devotion. Einar caught him staring after them. "You like this, don't you? Being remembered." Thalen shook his head. Being forgiven. That night, they camped beside a lake that reflected the stars too clearly, each one shimmering brighter in the water than in the sky. It was strange, like the heavens had chosen to look up for once. Einar sat by the fire, poking at the embers. "If everything's healing, what are we doing out here?" Thalen looked toward the lake. "Healing isn't peace. It's a conversation." "Between who?" "Between everything that thought it needed permission to exist." Einar frowned. And what happens when everyone starts talking at once? Thalen smiled. Then creation starts singing again. He walked to the edge of the lake, crouched, and dipped his hands into the water. The reflection shifted. Not his face. Not Einar's. Thousands of faces, mortals, spirits, gods, all flickering across the surface. Each one whispered a word. Thank you. Sorry. Forgive. Einar felt his chest tighten. Are they praying? No, Thalen said softly. They're remembering they never had to. The lake rippled outward, glowing. The light rose into the air, droplets floating like fireflies, and drifted upward, vanishing into the stars. But far away, in a place no mortal I could find, the old order was cracking. In the celestial hall, where the gods once ruled by decree, the pillars trembled. Statues of forgotten deities crumbled into dust, their names dissolving into whispers. And through that collapse, a single figure remained still. Ira, the Wind Mother, stood watching the horizon. Her hair moved like mist caught between calm and storm. He's remaking them, said a voice behind her. I know, she replied. You could stop him. I could, she said, but I don't want to. The other god, a tall, skeletal thing made of light and logic, stepped forward. He's eroding what makes us divine. Ira smiled faintly. Maybe we mistook divinity for distance. The figure hissed. You're sympathizing. No, she said, watching the stars flicker brighter. I'm remembering what it felt like to breathe. Down on Earth, Einar dreamed for the first time in weeks. In his dream, he stood at the edge of the sea, and the waves whispered secrets into his bones. One of them carried Thalen's voice. Calm, amused, sad. The sea forgives you for fearing it. Einar woke to find the lake calm again, Thalen sitting nearby, eyes closed, chest rising with slow, deliberate breaths. You were in my dream, Einar said. Thalen opened one eye. Did I say anything wise? You said something forgiving. Same thing. Einar sat beside him. So what happens now? Thalen looked at the sunrise. Now the world decides if it wants to keep breathing. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the edge of sight, thunder rolled, not in anger, but like applause. It began with laughter. Not thunder, not song, laughter. The kind of wild, untamed sound that should belong to a mortal, not to the sky. It rippled across the clouds, echoed through rivers, rolled down mountains like sunlight playing dress-up as sound. Einar jolted awake. Tell me that's not another god. Thalen didn't move. He was sitting by the lake, eyes half closed, listening. It's not an old one. Einar groaned. So now we got new ones? What did you do this time? Teach the clouds humor? Thalen smiled faintly. I didn't do this. The world did. Before Einar could ask what that meant, the lake stirred. Not with waves, with giggles. The water bubbled, shimmered, and rose into the air, swirling in a loose column of light. Within it, something took shape, small, child-sized, luminous, and curious. A girl, or the idea of one. Her hair shimmered like wet silver threads. Her eyes glowed with the reflection of every sunrise that had ever existed. She blinked, confused or delighted, and when she spoke, her voice sounded like a waterfall laughing at itself. Who taught everything to breathe? Thalen stood slowly. The air thickened, bending toward her like a bowing audience. I did. She tilted her head. Then who taught it to laugh? Einar muttered. We're doomed. The child stepped onto the shore, leaving tiny glowing footprints that bloomed into flowers where she walked. The rivers told me your name. They said you undrowned the world. Thalen smiled gently. And what's your name, little one? She frowned, thinking hard. I don't have one yet. I was born from a dream and a mistake. Einar raised an eyebrow. That checks out. Most kids are. Thalen gave him a warning look, then turned back to her. Who dreamed you? I don't know, she said, but I think I dreamed myself. Isn't that funny? She laughed again, and the grass around them glowed. Thalen stared, his expression unreadable. She's not divine, he whispered. Not entirely. She's something else. Einar scratched his head. Something else like, what? something the world made when it realized it didn't need gods to create any more. By noon, the child had explored everything within sight. She named the trees after sounds, told the cloud stories until they changed shapes to please her, and asked questions faster than Thalen could answer them. Why do people grow sad when it rains? Because they think the sky is crying. Why would the sky cry? To remember that it can. Why do you look like you're always listening? Because I am. She considered this gravely. That must be heavy. Thalen smiled softly. It's lighter than silence. Einar, meanwhile, was beginning to panic in a more practical way. So what happens when she grows up? Does she start inventing new species or rewriting gravity? Thalen didn't answer immediately. His gaze followed the girl as she skipped toward the riverbank. She's not destruction. She's curiosity. That's worse, Einar said flatly. Curiosity builds civilizations and ends them. Thalen's expression darkened. Maybe both are necessary. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, the girl sat cross-legged between them, humming to herself. I met someone, she said suddenly. Thalen looked up. When? Just now. Einar frowned. There's no one here. He's not here, she said, gesturing vaguely toward the sky. He said he used to be a god of order, but he forgot how to count after you broke the rules. Thalen went still. She's talking to them. The other gods? Einar asked. All of them, Thalen whispered. She's a bridge. The girl smiled, proud of herself. They were sad, but I told them it's all right to rest. I said everything keeps going even if they stop watching. Einar blinked. You told ancient divine powers to take a nap? She giggled. They needed one. The air shimmered faintly, like the world had just agreed. Later, after she'd fallen asleep by the fire, Einar whispered, She's powerful and dangerous. Thalen nodded slowly. She's creation's first self-correction. The universe saw me unmake fear and decided it needed laughter to balance it. Einar shook his head. You're saying the world just gave birth to a child made of joy. Joy and mistaken memory, Thalen said. All the things gods feared most. He looked toward her, small, glowing faintly in the dark, the pulse of her laughter still echoing in the air like a lullaby. She's the first of the new kind. Einar swallowed. And what she called? Thalen smiled. She hasn't chosen yet. In the sky above them, stars shifted, forming a faint pattern that looked almost like a child's handprint. The night exhaled. The rivers quieted, and the wind whispered something that sounded very much like a name trying itself out for the first time. Lyra. Thalen looked up. So that's it. Einar rubbed his face. Of course it is. The universe just named itself after a kid. Thalen laughed softly. Then perhaps it's learning faster than we did. Lyra woke before dawn, as if the world itself had nudged her awake just to see what she might do. The air around her shimmered faintly. Each breath she took left ripples in the mist. Thalen watched in silence. She was kneeling by the water, touching her reflection. Every time her fingers brushed the surface, the image smiled before she did, as if the lake wanted to reassure her it already knew the shape of her laughter. Einar stirred by the fire. Tell me she's not rewriting physics again. Thalen didn't answer. He was listening, eyes half closed. The rhythm of the world had changed again, softer, lighter, as though joy had replaced gravity. Lyra turned to him. The lake says it wants to fly. Thalen smiled faintly. Then what did you tell it? That it already does, just slower. Einar groaned. Wonderful. We've invented metaphysics with dimples. Lyra blinked, confused. What's metaphysics? Einar looked at Thalen. Explain that one, teacher. Thalen crouched beside her. It's what people talk about when they can't admit they're in love with mystery. She tilted her head. Thinking hard. Then that means everything is in love. Einar pointed at the sky. Even that? She nodded. Especially that. The sky misses touching things. And somewhere above them, the first light of morning scattered like laughter through clouds. As they walked through the forest later that day, the trees bent slightly to follow her path. Flowers opened out of season. Even stones hummed with faint warmth. The air smelled of rain and honey. Thalen watched, wonder mixed with dread. She's weaving emotion into matter, he murmured. Einar frowned. Meaning? Meaning that soon, the world won't wait for our intentions. It'll start making its own. Lyra skipped ahead, balancing on a fallen log. Look, she said. I made the shadows softer. Einar squinted. She did. That's unnatural. Thalen shook his head. No, it's the most natural thing possible. Creation's remembering how to play. He paused. But play has rules, and rules get broken. By nightfall, they reached a meadow glowing under twin moons that hadn't existed the day before. Lyra lay in the grass, pointing at constellations that changed shape to match her stories. Einar sat beside Thalen, whispering, You're worried. She's doing what I did, Thalen said quietly, changing the balance without understanding the cost. You mean she's making mistakes? She is a mistake, Thalen said softly, then winced at his own words. Not in the cruel sense, in the creative one. She's the proof that imperfection can create beauty. Then why does that sound like a bad thing? Because beauty without restraint becomes hunger. Einar looked at the stars, now spiraling gently across the sky like dancers losing their rhythm. You think she'll destroy the world? Thalen shook his head. No, I think she'll make it too perfect to survive. At dawn, the world began to glow. Not sunlight, something deeper. Color itself had grown restless. The rivers reflected not blue or gold, but emotion. Joy, grief, longing, hope. Birds sang in harmonies that sounded like questions. People woke weeping from dreams they couldn't describe, feeling healed and lost at once. Lyra stood in the center of a hill, arms outstretched. It feels like the world is breathing through me. It is, Thalen said, but it doesn't know how to stop. Einar stepped forward, alarmed. Thalen! She's glowing again. The light pouring from her wasn't harsh. It was gentle, pulsing like a heartbeat shared by everything that existed. Flowers bloomed and withered within seconds. Rain fell upward into the sky. Lyra turned toward them, eyes wide. Am I doing wrong? Thalen's voice cracked. No, you're doing too right. She frowned. Then why does it hurt? Thalen rushed to her, kneeling. Because the universe isn't ready to love itself this much. Her light flickered. Then what do I do? He took her hand, trembling. You learn what I didn't. You learn to stop. But stopping feels like dying. It feels like trusting, he whispered. The glow dimmed slightly. The world steadied. Birds landed again. The sky sighed. Einar approached carefully. You good? Lyra nodded weakly. I think I heard something. What? A voice. Thalen's heart tightened. Whose? She looked up at the now calm sky. The one that started everything. It said, Thank you for reminding me why I made it. Thalen exhaled slowly. Then even the beginning has learned. That night, they camped by a quiet stream. The glow around Lyra had faded, but her laughter still made ripples move toward her, as though the world were listening. Einar sat with Thalen by the fire. So what now? You're going to teach her how to be a god. Thalen smiled sadly. No, I'm going to teach her how not to be one. Einar raised an eyebrow. And how's that work? By teaching her that love doesn't need control. They sat in silence. The fire popped softly. In the distance, thunder rolled once, gentle, approving. Later, while the others slept, Thalen looked up at the stars Lyra had rearranged. They now formed a simple pattern, a spiral leading inward, not outward. He whispered to the sky, Is this what you wanted for me? And the wind, quiet, kind, familiar, answered, No, it's what I wanted for you. By the time the 15th sunrise arrived, the world was dreaming with its eyes open. Villages woke to skies that painted themselves. Forests hummed lullabies to travelers. Rivers chose new paths just to see what different felt like. The mountains no longer echoed thunder. They answered it. Everywhere, creation had begun to imitate wonder. Thalen watched it all with quiet awe and growing unease. It's working, Einar said, as they crossed a valley now glowing with bioluminescent grass. People are laughing again. Crops growing, Storm singing, no one's dying. You did it. Thalen didn't smile. No, she did it. Lyra walked ahead of them, skipping barefoot, each step leaving a spark of light that lingered just long enough to remind the ground it was alive. Everywhere she went, things flourished, yet the air carried a strange tension, a sweetness on the verge of becoming too rich to taste. Too much of anything, Thalen murmured. Even love becomes gravity. Einar frowned. Meaning if joy doesn't learn to rest, it collapses. That night, they reached a town that no longer slept. People filled the streets, dancing and singing under perpetual twilight. The air shimmered with sound, bells, laughter, flutes that played themselves. Even the shadows moved as though keeping rhythm. Lyra clapped her hands in delight. They're happy. Thalen's chest tightened. They're trapped in it. Einar looked around, realizing it too. No one stopped moving since we got here. A woman passed by, her smile wide and empty. Why would we stop? The world finally loves us back. Lyra stepped forward. Do you sleep? Sleep? The woman laughed, eyes unfocused. Who needs sleep when everything's perfect? The crowd swayed as one, their joy mechanical now, heavy with exhaustion disguised as bliss. Thalen whispered. They've forgotten silence. At the center of the town stood a fountain. Its water glowed gold, pulsing with the same rhythm as the people's laughter. Lyra knelt beside it. It's beautiful. Thalen knelt too, dipping a hand into the glowing water. His reflection smiled up at him, but it wasn't his own. It was serene, false, too calm. He stood abruptly. It's feeding on itself. Joy without balance becomes hunger. Lyra stared at her reflection. I didn't mean to. I know, he said softly. But even creation can overdose on light. He turned to Einar. We have to quiet it. Einar looked around. How? Half the town's possessed by good vibes. Thalen raised his hand. The air thickened, the fountain surface trembling. The same way I quieted the sea, by teaching it to listen. Lyra grabbed his wrist. Don't hurt them. I'm not, he said gently. I'm asking them to rest. He exhaled slowly. The sound rolled through the square like the first breath after a long cry. One by one, people began to slow. Laughter turned to sighs. Music softened. The fountain dimmed. Some fell to their knees. Some wept. Some simply stood in wonder at the silence they hadn't heard in days. Einar exhaled shakily. I'll admit you have a talent for ending parties. Thalen smiled faintly. I'm not ending anything. I'm reminding the world that peace and stillness are the same thing said differently. Lyra touched the fountain, now calm and clear. It feels sad now. That's how balance feels, Thalen said. Not loud, honest. They left before dawn. The town slept the first time since the new world began. Einar trudged beside him, yawning. So what now? You taught the sea mercy, the gods regret, the rivers forgiveness, and now joy restraint. What's left? Thalen's eyes flicked toward Lyra. Fear. Fear. He nodded. The only thing creation hasn't made peace with, the last breath it still holds. Einar stared. You're going to teach fear? You just fixed everything. Not everything, Thalen said quietly. Without fear, love forgets its depth. Without depth, it becomes decoration. Lyra walked between them, her small face thoughtful. So fear isn't bad? Thalen smiled. Fear is what tells us something matters. She looked up. Do gods feel fear? He hesitated. The good ones learn to. As night fell again, the sky fractured into streaks of color, auroras rippling like slow fire. Thalen stood beneath it, feeling something shift inside him, a tremor not power but of recognition. Lyra sat nearby, humming softly. Her tune echoed across the valley, echoed by unseen voices. The rivers, the trees, the wind, even the stars. It wasn't worship. It was harmony. Einar lay on his back, staring upward. It's beautiful. So why do I feel like we're close to breaking something again? Thalen's answer was a whisper. Because we are... He closed his eyes. When a world becomes too full of light, shadows have nowhere left to go. And somewhere, Far beyond the veil of the visible, something stirred, a shape older than gods, born from silence and envy, watching the laughter of the living world and remembering the taste of stillness before the first dawn. Its first thought was simple, cold, and patient. They've forgotten who waits in the dark. It came back at dusk, when even joy forgets what it's doing. At first, the world only hesitated. The wind stopped mid-song, as though holding its own throat, and the trees froze with their leaves half trembling. The river stiffened mid-current, their laughter trapped under a glassy surface. The sky dimmed, not like nightfall, but like doubt. And then, from a horizon where light had never dared die completely, something began to crawl. Not a storm, not a shadow cast by anything visible. It moved like memory, slow, ancient, sure of itself. Thalen felt it before he saw it. A silence so perfect it made his pulse stutter. He stood at once, every fragment of his old divinity whispering warnings through mortal nerves. "It's awake," he said. Einar looked up from the fire, squinting through the half-light. "Define it." "The first silence," Thalen whispered. "The one that existed before creation dared to speak." Lyra's glow dimmed, her small face tilted toward the horizon. "But you said silence was healed." Thalen shook his head slowly. "I healed the noise, little one. The silence was only sleeping." The horizon cracked, and out stepped a figure, vast, featureless, swallowing light without effort. Wherever it moved, color bled to gray, song collapsed, and even air seemed to lose its weight. When it spoke, its voice wasn't sound. It was subtraction. "You ruined perfection." Thalen's voice trembled, not from fear, but recognition. "No," he said softly. "I gave it breath. Breath is noise. Breath is life. Life is interruption." Thalen took a slow step forward, his shadow refusing to follow him. "And silence," he said, "is what comes when we forget why we began." The figure tilted its invisible head. "You were meant to end, not begin again." Einar muttered under his breath, "I hate when evil things are good at debating." The darkness advanced. Lyra clutched Thalen's hand, her light flickering. "It's cold," she whispered. "It's nothing," he said. "And nothing always wants more of itself." The creature lifted something like a hand, and the air thinned. The world seemed to inhale, preparing to forget how to exhale. Thalen fell to his knees. He could feel the sea shuddering miles away, the river slowing, the stars dimming like frightened eyes. Einar shouted, "Do something." "I can't." Thalen gasped. "It's what I was before I learned mercy. It remembers me." Lyra stepped forward. "Then it remembers me too." "Lyra, no." But she was already walking toward the void. Her light trembled, then steadied like a candle refusing to die. "You're not evil," she said softly. "You're scared." The shadow hesitated. "Fear does not belong to me." "Yes, it does," she answered. "You're afraid of being forgotten." It flinched. "Everything must rest." "I know," she said, "but resting isn't the same as racing." She extended her small hand toward the vast shape. "You're allowed to sleep without ending." The darkness shivered. The sky above it warped like a mirror remembering its cracks. The stars flickered faster, like a heart learning its rhythm again. Thalen tried to stand but couldn't. "She's doing what I never could." Einar grabbed his shoulder. "What's she doing?" Thalen's eyes filled with tears. "Forgiving the dark." The shadow leaned closer, its edges unraveling into smoke and starlight. "You would forgive silence?" Lyra smiled gently. "I already did. You're the part of the song that lets it rest." For the first time since time began, the silence sighed, not an absence, but a sound softer than anything alive. A tired exhale. It folded inward, collapsing like mist catching sunrise. The air warmed. The river stirred. The stars blinked back, hesitant but hopeful. And then it was gone. Lyra stood in the fading dark, her glow dimming to a gentle halo. "It's sleeping again," she said in a trembling whisper, this time without loneliness. Thalen reached her and dropped to his knees. "You did what gods never could." She smiled faintly. "I listened." He took her hand and pressed it to his chest. "You'll be the world's next breath." No, she murmured, leaning against him. You both will. Together. By morning, the world had changed again, quiet, alive, balanced. The rivers flowed without hymns. The winds whispered without fear. Even the sea lay calm, breathing slow, its surface smooth as forgiveness. Einar cooked breakfast on a small fire, muttering, "So we didn't all die. That's new." Thalen sat beside Lyra, who was half asleep, her light faint as morning fog. "No," he said softly. "We just finished dying properly." Einar frowned. "That's supposed to be comforting?" Thalen smiled. "It's supposed to be true." They watched the sunrise together. The light was ordinary now. No divine shimmer, no heavenly chorus. Just sunlight touching water, birds calling, the wind moving through grass. For the first time in existence, ordinary felt sacred. Einar stretched, groaning. "So what now, god of ex-gods?" Thalen looked toward the horizon. "Now we stop teaching the world. We let it learn." Lyra stirred without opening her eyes. "Then it's your turn to rest." He nodded, just long enough to dream again. She smiled sleepily. "Don't make it too long. The world might miss your breath." Thalen laughed softly. "Then I'll breathe quietly." When they left the valley, the sky was clear. The air was full of small, deliberate sounds. Grass bending, waves sighing, laughter too distant to find its source. Behind them, where Lyra had stood, a single flower grew. Not quite real, not quite dream. Its petals shimmered like dew made of starlight, pulsing once every few seconds, as though the planet itself had learned a lullaby. Einar stopped, looking back. "You think she'll be okay?" "She already is," Thalen said. "And you?" He smiled. "Finally, I'm just a man who taught the sea to listen." They walked until the horizon swallowed them. The last thing to fade was the sound of breathing, steady, fragile, utterly human. Not divine, not eternal, just alive. And for the first time since the beginning of all things, the world kept breathing on its own. Night came gently without command. The stars didn't shout, they hummed. Somewhere far away, the sea exhaled as though relieved that it no longer had to worship itself. In that silence, true silence, the kind that listens back, something small but eternal shifted, a rhythm fragile and new, keeping time with every creature, every drop, every sigh. The world had learned the oldest secret Thalen had tried to teach. That life isn't the opposite of stillness, and mercy isn't the opposite of fear. Both are simply different ways of saying breathe.